Today I want to talk about the Catholic Pope, and I want to ask a couple questions like, is the Pope even biblical? Does the Bible say that the Pope is really a biblical position? The Catholic Church claims that Peter was the first Pope, but is that actually true? Join us today to find the answers. All right, today I want to talk about this question: is the Pope even biblical? How's that? Like, what is the deal with that? Because we've seen how much the Catholic Church reveres him. We see how the Catholic Church trusts him. We know that they listen to his every word. We've seen him in his Pope mobile and him waving to people, and he has unquestionable authority in the Catholic Church. But why is that? Is what he's doing even biblical? Is like there a pope in the Bible that we should know about? Because the Catholic Church actually claims that Peter was the first pope, but I don't know, is that really what the Bible says? Today we're going to have Mike Winger. He's a great Bible teacher. He studied the differences between biblical Christianity and Roman Catholicism. And he's going to be here to answer this question that we have about the Pope, because the Catholic Church actually does believe in the same Jesus, the same God, the same Holy Spirit, but they believe completely different on a lot of issues, the Pope being one of them, but actually salvation on another part of it. The Catholic Church believes that it's Jesus plus what you can do. And my greatest desire for this question and answer series regarding the Catholic Church is I want to make sure that we get it right, that we point people to the biblical truth of salvation, which is through Jesus alone, not through a church, not through any church, not through the Catholic Church, not through your good works and doing good things, not a church that has an authority figure like the Pope telling you something different than what the Bible has already spoken on. Because Jesus has told us himself how to spend eternity with him, and it is not through the Catholic Church. Jesus says in John 14:6, he said, "I'm the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." Salvation is through Jesus alone. Acts 4:12 says, "Nor is there salvation in any other than Jesus. For there is no name under heaven given among men for which we must be saved." So, what I want to do is I want to play a clip from our Contending for the Faith conference that I did with Mike Winger, and I want him to answer this question about the Pope and his supposed authority and find out, does the Bible even say that this is a position that should be had? So watch this.
So you make a really great statement when you talk about how Catholicism would actually crumble if you got rid of this whole church authority thing, because that's where most of these unbiblical documents or doctrines come from, and they come from that because of the authority of the church. So if you can prove that the authority of the church is not a biblical thing, then it kind of wipes away Catholicism. So explain that.
Yeah. Now, just so you know, I affirm church authority in many ways. There's lots of there's legitimate authority in the church. The biblical way of looking at it is that we have the teaching of the apostles, which we have recorded in the New Testament, that we must hold fast to. That trumps every authority, right? Even if an angel of heaven and all that stuff. So, but then we have leaders in the church. In the New Testament, they're elders and bishops, same person. Those terms are used interchangeably. And then we have deacons. Okay, and these are kind of the offices in the church that are to be appointed. There's other functions in the church, but those are the offices. But in Catholicism, the authority of the church takes on a whole new dimension, just totally not found in Scripture at all. And that's about the Pope. Centrally, it comes down to the Pope. The unity and the teaching and the authority and the claims of the Catholic Church come down to the Pope. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 937, says this: "The Pope enjoys, by divine institution, nothing less than supreme, full, immediate, and universal power in the care of souls." 883 says this: The college or body of bishops, these are Catholic bishops, has no authority unless united with the Roman pontiff, that's the Pope, Peter's successor as its head. As such, this college has supreme and full authority over the universal church, but this power cannot be exercised without the agreement of the Roman pontiff. So, I mean, he is the key. With Pope, you have total authority. Everybody else in the world without Pope, you don't have that authority. Like this is the claim of the church. In Vatican I, they make some specific claims about this papacy, this idea of this Pope, this one ruler of the church. And notice this, that they claim that it's ancient and constant, that the beliefs that they're about to... So hold on, let me back up and just say this. In Vatican I, they've just finished saying that in Matthew 16 and in John 21, that we have Jesus instituting Peter as the first Pope. Then they go on and they say here in Vatican I, everyone has always known this. So remember this claim, we're going to test it. It says, we, for the preservation, safekeeping, and increase of the Catholic flock, with the approval of the Sacred Council, judge it to be necessary to propose for the belief and acceptance of all the faithful in accordance with the ancient and constant faith of the universal church, the doctrine of the institution, perpetuity, and nature of the sacred apostolic primacy. Now, this is massive because what they've just done is they've said the nature of this Pope of having supreme authority over everything, this has always been known. Everybody knew it, and it's especially in Matthew 16 and John 21. Well, those are the two passages they offer. If this is true, I want to be Catholic. Like if that's true, I want to be Catholic because I'm not opposed to being in submission to proper authorities. That's what I want to do. But if it's not true, it's a pretty big issue. I've heard one prominent evangelical pastor say the Pope is our Pope. He's like, he's our Pope. And I'm like, there is no Pope. If it's not true, he's a usurper claiming massive authority claims that just are completely unfounded and then giving doctrines authoritatively based on those claims. So this is a big deal. Now, biblically speaking, Matthew 16 is where Jesus says, like, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom. Peter, you're the rock. And on this rock, I will build. You are Peter the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. It's that phrase. Now the weird thing is this: if you were just doing a Bible study, you might be like, wait, is Peter the rock, or is the claim that Jesus is the Messiah, is that the rock? You would be asking those questions. What do the keys mean? Let's go through the rest of the New Testament. How are the keys used? Like, what is this all talking about? But the Catholic Church says, like, no. When Jesus says, here's the keys, Peter, you are Peter the rock, what he's really doing is he's instituting that Peter is the Pope. He's the leader of all the apostles. He has the full authority of Christ on earth. And everybody else in the world, if they don't agree with him, they have no authority. If they agree with him, they have his authority effectively, right? This is the authority claims. And that Peter is then going to establish the Rome as the future location where this future papacy is going to continue to exist, and it'll exist in perpetuity. It's not just for the first century; it's forever. Like all that's coming out of like you're a rock, and here's the keys.
Right.
This is not how we do Bible study. Right? This is like in Mormonism when they say, "Well, Paul said 3 heavens, so we have celestial, terrestrial, and telestial." You're like, wait a minute, you just literally made up a word. Telestial, it doesn't even exist. Like that's not how you do Bible study. So, did the apostles think that this made Peter above them and leading the church as basically the head of the church after this? I'll give you several reasons really quickly why not. We could spend all day on this one verse, but we won't. So one, the apostles continued to argue about who was the greatest, both in Matthew and in Luke, and even in the Garden of Gethsemane, way after Jesus supposedly gave apostolic primacy to Peter. Why are they arguing who's the greatest?
Right.
Like, and why isn't Jesus like, obviously Peter's the greatest, you numbskulls? Like, didn't you see me? I gave him the keys. In Matthew 18, Jesus applies the keys and binding and loosing. He applies it to the whole church, not just Peter. Peter's kind of like was seen as a spokesman, not as the single head of the church, especially in Matthew 18, verses 18 through 20. Binding and loosing, the activity of the keys, is seen as being given to the church as a whole. Peter, again, he's the spokesman. He's not the Pope. He speaks what the church is thinking, and then he responds to that claim. In number 3, in Acts chapter 15, there's a council in the early church, the first council we read about in anywhere in history, And it's James, not Peter, who seems to push the final decision, seems to be leading. Peter has his important role. I'm not against Peter. He has an important role, but we can't call that papacy in action. Acts 15 doesn't look like that at all.
Right.
Number 4, Paul, he actually offers us a description of Peter's ministry. And he doesn't say supreme pontiff of the universal church. He doesn't say head of the church, vicar of Christ. He says Paul says that Peter is the apostle to the Jews.
Right.
Wait, that doesn't even fit if he's the Pope, right? The Pope it's universal. There's no to the Jews thing going on here. So, Paul actually lists in one point where he lists the pillars of the church in Galatians. He puts them in this order: James, Cephas, which is Peter, and John. James, Cephas, John. You don't now when you're listing and the Pope is on your list, guess who comes first? The Pope, right? Now then he goes on to say that these 3 pillars agreed that Paul should go to the Gentiles and the 3 of them should go to the circumcised. And they're considered about reaching apostolically, evangelically out to the world. There's no idea in their head of a papacy going on right now. Peter calls himself a fellow elder in 1 Peter chapter 5. He also calls Jesus the chief shepherd. So he's just a fellow elder, right? I'm just a fellow elder. Jesus is the chief shepherd. This isn't just humility. He's just giving us a description of, the way things really are. And then finally, a 7th thing I'll mention is that continuing offices in the church are mentioned throughout the New Testament. We read about them all the time. We never read about a pope, and it would be pretty significant to give us that indication, right?
Yeah.
If you're pretending to have an office that the New Testament knows nothing about. So here's an example. Catholic historian Eamon Duffy. Here's a Catholic historian. He says, there is nothing directly approaching a papal authority in the pages of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
In Roman, but not Catholic, that book I recommended earlier, they write this: the substance of Matthew 16:18, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, was never interpreted. Catch that, never interpreted by the 1st century church in terms of claims to preeminence by a non-existent monarchical bishop of Rome, or even later by the apostolic fathers once this office eventually emerged. That's because historically in the 1st century, there was a lot of different, leaders in Rome, bishops or elders in Rome. There wasn't even one who was in charge of them all. Like that took a whole development of history before that even started to happen. So it's just weird. But in Vatican I, they say that Matthew 16 has always been understood to make Peter the Pope. And for it to talk about apostolic primacy, that Peter's the boss of the church and he's in charge of everybody else. It has, quote, ever been understood this way. So this means I can test a historical and biblical claim of a infallible council of the Catholic Church in Vatican I. Well, the French Roman Catholic Lannoy, he surveyed the writings of the church fathers to see what the early church said about Matthew 16. Did they say that this made him the Pope? He found 17 citations from church fathers who agreed that Matthew 16, when he says the rock, it's referring to Peter. So 17 citations that make Peter the rock. Now, they did not say that Peter was the Pope. Most of them don't even talk about that because it was historically didn't exist yet. But they did say that the phrase the rock referred to Peter. He found 16 citations that identify the rock as Christ. So those are split 50-50. He found 8 that identified the rock as all of the disciples. Not just Peter, but all the disciples. And he found 44 citations that identified the rock as the confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So the favorite interpretation of the church fathers is that the rock is the confession of trusting Christ as God. Mm-hmm. Now, 80% of the time, the church fathers disagree with the Roman Catholic position. 80%. Yet Vatican I says that this has always ever been the known belief of the universal church. Because Vatican I made stuff up, which is why a lot of Roman Catholics left when Vatican I in 1870 came out and said this stuff. And they're like, yeah, that's just not real. It's not true. But the Pope of the time was demanding that they affirm these things. And they even argued, at one point, the council people were like, we don't want to say some of these things. And the church isn't in agreement. Look, we're voting. We are not in agreement about all these things you want in the council. And the Pope said, I am the church. And so they had to continue pushing it forward because some popes are not as humble as Francis.
Right.
You get a mixed bag. So there's no papacy in
if you got rid of
go ahead.
the papacy totally, then the whole thing crumbles.
Yeah, it becomes a usurping claim instead of there is no authentic papacy to look for in the first century. It doesn't exist. So you can't trace it to any modern person because the ancient thing never was there in the first place. It developed over time. So it was very gradual. So I'll do it in a couple stages here. Initially, there were, like I said, multiple elders or bishops in Rome. There was not just one who was in charge of them all. That's during the first century. Late in the second century, then we start to get a monarchical bishop. Well, one bishop who's like, I'm in charge of the region of Rome, but he's not like the Pope. He's not claiming, universal authority over the world and over every Christian. That's centuries later. But that's when you first start to get it. Over 100 years later, we first start to get the idea of someone who's the guy who's in charge of Rome. The historian Kenneth Collins, he says this: clearly, Rome continually reads back into the past much later historical products as if they were ever present. To claim, for example, that the Apostle Peter was the first pope is akin to the error in stating, in the 4th century, the United States of America had few people. Right? Because there was no United States. It just didn't exist. Such a statement simply doesn't compute. The city that was of such great importance to the Christian faith in the mid-1st century was not Rome, but Jerusalem. And after that, it was Antioch, thus once again, not Rome. The earliest pope, who you could probably start to say is looking at claiming some of the power of the modern pope, right? Like he's not only saying like, I'm the bishop of Rome altogether, but he's starting to like flex a little more, is Leo in the 5th century. That's one of the earliest guys you could say, here's a guy who, some would argue he is actually a pope. We actually have a pope now, in the somewhat modern sense. But let me read to you. Here's a book I'd recommend. This is the Matthew 16 controversy. People want to read on just Matthew 16, just that one issue. Here's a whole book for you. Early church fathers and what they said. But allow me to read to you. This is Gregory the Great. He is the 64th pope if you ask the Roman Catholic Church, right? They say they have had all these popes. According to them, he is the 64th pope. So by now, right, everybody knows what the papacy is now in all its authority claims. But Gregory the Great actually rejected the title pope for himself. And rejected some of the official titles that are currently part of the Pope. He rejected those things. But he had a letter that he wrote to John, the Bishop of Constantinople. Now, John, the Bishop of Constantinople at the time, they were kind of like, they were all rising in power. The bishops were getting more and more heavy-headed and big-headed in their power beyond the New Testament, right? Now, Constantinople is one of the cities that's like trying to claim a lot more authority than he ought to have. Mm-hmm. And so look at what Gregory writes, because this guy calls himself the universal head, that he's the one in charge. He basically claims to be a pope, the Bishop of Constantinople. Listen to what Gregory, quote, the Pope, says about him. It says, what wilt thou say to Christ, who is the head of the universal church, in the scrutiny of the last judgment, having attempted to put all his members under thyself by the appellation of universal? He's opposed to not only that guy doing it, anybody calling himself the universal head of the church. And he's like, you're going to get judged for that. Let me read on. And when thou desirest to put thyself above them by this proud title and to tread down their name in comparison with thine, what else dost thou say, but I will ascend into heaven? I will exalt my throne above the stars of heaven. Are not all the bishops together clouds, who both reign in the words and preaching and glitter in the light of good works? And when your fraternity despises them, and you would fain press them down under yourself, what else say you but what is said by the ancient foe, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds? He's saying, if you want to try to say you're higher than other bishops, which even at that point, the concept of bishops going beyond the New Testament, so I don't agree with it, but he's saying, like, if you're going to be the one who's above all the others, that's satanic, right? He quotes Satan. He's like, that's satanic. Let me read on. Certainly, Peter, the first of the apostles, himself a member of the holy and universal church, Paul, Andrew, and John, what were they? Now here is, get ready for it, right? Here's Pope Gregory, supposedly Pope Gregory, right? The guy who rejects the title Pope, still exercising more power than he should biblically. But he is now writing about who Peter was in the church, right? Certainly Peter, Paul, Andrew, and John, what were they? But heads of particular communities.
Oh, wow.
Peter was just a head of a particular community, according to Gregory, who's one of the, like, this is part of the problem with Catholic tradition, is that there's all these conflicting statements even in the tradition. So you have to look at the modern church to tell you what you're supposed to hold on to and what you're supposed to reject. But here's a pope saying something that Vatican II would say, no, he didn't say that, you know? Anyway, he goes on, he says, now let your holiness, he calls the other guy your holiness, let your holiness acknowledge to what extent you will swell within yourself in desiring to be called by that name by which no one presumed to be called who is truly holy. He goes on, he has other writings to, like, the Bishop of Alexandria, when they write back and forth, and the Bishop of Alexandria addresses him as like universal pope, and he hates it.
Right.
So he writes to the Bishop of Alexandria. Yeah, isn't that interesting? He says, you have thought it fit to make use of a proud appellation, calling me universal pope. But I beg your most sweet holiness to do this no more, since what is given to another beyond what reason demands is subtracted from yourself. See, Gregory's concern is that the bishop in Alexandria, he thought had equal authority as him. And he says, you call me this, you take away your own authority. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
He goes on and says, for if your holiness calls me universal pope, you deny that you are yourself what you call me universally. But far be this from us, away with words that inflate vanity and wound charity.
Right.
And it goes on and on. I could read pages and pages of content. Now, in this book, the Matthew 16 controversy by William Webster, there are a lot of church fathers that are quoted by Catholics to suggest that they believed in the papacy.
Right.
He offers their quotes in more detail and more context, so you can see that they didn't even know about the papacy, right? It didn't exist at that early time. Because
well, that's what we always said.
Development over time.
We talked about this, like, if you were stuck on an island with just your Bible, it's just like, you'd never come up with the Mormon Church, you'd never come up with Jehovah's Witness, you would never come up with the papacy.
I cannot reiterate this enough. The Bible has to be our final authority in life. It is the only book that God takes full credit for writing. We cannot take the Pope's authority, the church's hierarchy, none of those. We have to go by what the Bible alone says. I'll be putting links below for our Contending for the Faith conference, the 2 sessions in its entirety with Mike Winger. And also our difficult questions and short answers series. I'll put a link for that so you can see all the different religions that we're talking about. So hopefully that helped you today. Have a really good day.